Hello, and welcome to the first webinar in the Faith and Finance series, Building a Loving and Just Economy. I'm Rosalie Harden. I'm the executive producer of Faith and Finance. And for those of you not familiar with our organization, we're a growing community of people of faith, finding new ways to have conversations about and engage with an economy that doesn't always serve all of God's people. I'm coming to you today from Camp Allen, the Episcopal Conference Center in Navasota, Texas, where we were invited, Faith and Finance, Kevin Jones, my husband, and I, to come and have a conversation with the clergy here about taking seriously the church's engagement in the economy. And this conversation just keeps growing and growing. We're excited about that. Before we dig into this first webinar, I want to tell you a little bit about what's coming up next in the series. In November, we're looking forward to a conversation between Andre Perry and Eve Poole. Andre is the author of Know Your Price, and Eve has written a couple of books, one that we've looked at before here at Faith and Finance called Buying God, and another book, which is more on point for this next event, is Capitalism's Toxic Assumptions. Their conversation is going to be around the topic that the economy is not gravity. In other words, while capitalism may feel like it's a force of nature, it isn't. There are things that we can do to help shape the economy to be more loving and just. This is a 4-part series. There will be another session in December and another one in the first of the year, and more information on that will be coming to you soon. Today, our topic is very basic. Why faith and finance? I'll tell you, in the last few weeks, I've been asked to speak at 3 or 4 faith events about money. I've been asked to read 3 advanced copies of faith books about money. So what's going on? Why is it that people are talking about this topic now? I think we have some clues about that in the way that we are seeing the economy serve the rich and the poor are being left out. But there's still a lot to be explored about what's going on in this connection between faith and finance. So today we welcome Rabbi Elan Babchuck, who is head of the Glean Network. They work with faith-oriented entrepreneurs and with entrepreneurship funds. Stephanie Swepson-Twitty, who is a local activist in Asheville, North Carolina, where she has built financial tools for minority entrepreneurs. And Amit Bouri. Amit is the head of the GIIN, the Global Impact Investors Network. The Global Impact Investors Network. Even they have a faith office now. This conversation will be moderated by Otho Kerr, who is from the Office of Community Development at the Fed in New York. He's researching this topic. The Fed is getting engaged in why faith and finance, and he'll be interviewing our panelists. Before we go to that panel, I want to give you a few technical notes. Due to locations and schedules and various and sundry things, we had to pre-record their conversation, but this webinar is live. We will be having a conversation while the panel is going on through the chat function. So we encourage you to put your questions in. We will be answering questions there, pointing to resources. We encourage you to point to resources we don't know about so that we can know a lot more when the conversation is ended. And as soon as Otho finishes the conversation with our panelists, Rachel Johnson and Kevin Jones from Faith and Finance will be joined by Rabbi Babchuck and by Stephanie Swepson-Twitty, and we'll be there live for us to continue this conversation. So we hope you will join us for that conversation coming up in about 45 minutes. We look forward to learning more about why faith and finance together. So now let's hear from our panelists.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. I am here with 3 fascinating individuals with whom I've had a chance to be in conversation, to hear about the work that they're doing. And I'm delighted to be able to have this conversation with the listening community out there today. I would love to start by actually focusing on the title of this particular webinar. The title of the webinar is "We Need to Talk About Money, Connecting Faith and Finance." And when I hear the words connecting faith and finance, I think it actually means different things to different individuals. But I'm going to ask our panelists here today to tell me, when you hear connecting faith and finance, what does that mean to you? And I'm going to start with you, Stephanie. Connecting faith and finance, what does that mean to you?
When I think about connecting faith and finance, I'm quickly driven to scripture, where scripture tells us that we must be, and I'm paraphrasing terribly, but diligent to take care of the poor among us. And so what does that look like when we frame it in that way? Certainly we understand that poverty can be a multiple of things. However, as I look to the community in this moment of my work, I look at how can they continue to support community in innovative approaches, i.e. small businesses that are located as anchors in their community, who they can support either through patronage or through developing funding streams to help those small businesses to be job creators and continue to be anchors in their community.
Terrific. Thank you, Stephanie. Elan.
One of the reasons why, as soon as I think I got my first invitation to a faith and finance conversation, I don't even think I read the invitation. I'm going. Why? Because these two concepts, first of all, it's a really great alliteration. Anytime you have good alliteration, sign me up. But because they are intricately connected, right? And we need to bring them in conversation with one another, right? I think the faith community is just acceptable. That's not our domain. We don't mess with that. And of course, like you can't, you can't talk about faith values in most financial spaces, and the two shall never meet. And yet, I'm a rabbi in the Jewish community, and this year is a sabbatical year. It just started a month ago. The sabbatical is the quintessential way that faith and finance should intertwine. Not that one should govern the other, but that they should be in conversation. The sabbatical year is about letting the land rest. It's about forgiving debts. It's about starting fresh. It's about reminding ourselves what is enough. It's essentially about inviting the financial marketplace to understand that that there's more than just the bottom line, that one bottom line, when it comes to thinking about our impact. I think the other piece of it, in terms of bringing these together, is understanding that there is no faith without finance, right? Every one of our religious traditions, it's not like all of our ancestors were volunteers. It's not like the people who built the synagogue up the street or the church down the street got all the materials donated. There was money involved, of course, right? That we need to understand that faith without finance doesn't exist, right? The giving and receiving of blessings and curses, the navigating of scarcity and abundance, that those two are deeply connected. And similarly, there's no such thing as finance without faith, right? The entire market system was designed in our ancient religious communities. And I think that not just faith, religion, but also the market doesn't work. Finance doesn't work if we don't have faith, if we don't have trust in one another. And of course, trust is the thing that is eroded more than anything else when it comes to how individual people and as our society's collective relates to the financial institutions themselves. The finance depends on that faith, that we can trust institutions that are beyond our reach, that we can trust marketplaces that are beyond our comprehension. Without that faith, which we lack right now, GameStop shares are skyrocketing and a basket of fruit is worthless. Like that, we need these two to be in conversation with one another.
Thank you. Amit.
Thank you so much, and it's such an honor to be here with this great panel. And this is an interesting topic for us, and one that we've been looking at it, from the Global Impact Investing Network's perspective. Just very briefly, in terms of how we come to this conversation. So we're a network of investors who are focused on impact investing, having a positive impact, a positive measurable impact alongside a financial return. And increasingly, we've seen growing interest and opportunity to engage more broader audiences with how they can manifest their values through their investments, whether it be caring for the environment and helping to support the long-term health of the planet, or working at a community level and caring for those who are more disadvantaged. One thing that I think is quite powerful, but also and goes back a long ways, but also at the same time is underutilized, is this intersection of faith and finance. There's a long tradition of communities of faith using investments and to help influence things for the better in the world. And at the same time, we also see a lot of communities of faith who have not thought about how they can use their assets for impact investments, to help advance their own objectives of trying to help care for those less well off, whether it be in their local communities or all around the world, or to help take care of the planet and the environment. So I think this is an incredibly important conversation. It's incredibly exciting to have this with such a great group. But I think that we're just kind of like scratching the surface of the potential to look at this intersection of faith and finance.
I think your answers illustrate what I began appreciating throughout the day when I talked with colleagues of mine and shared the title with them, because they were actually sort of offering their own thoughts in an array of ways as you offered up. I think that faith and finance to many of us means faith being involved in making those impactful investments, as Amit just articulated, and in serving the poor, as Stephanie said. But I also think, as Elan said, that there is this sense when one hears faith and finance, maybe it's faith in the economy, faith in institutions that we're talking about, not just faith-based institutions. Faith and finance to me represents the role of morality in the economy and the ability of faith-based institutions to help drive us to make morally correct decisions with a strong moral compass. It means having investors who are faith-based, independent of their own institution, making investments in organizations and in companies and in peoples that, again, is morally driven based on their faith. But it's also, as Amit says, having faith-based institutions realize that they can be strong leaders and lead by example by directing their capital into investments, into people, into communities that are underserved and could use that capital. We went around and I asked you for your definition, but I haven't had the chance to hear, what do each one of you do? Amit, we heard your title and you explained a little bit about the GIIN, but you might want to explain a bit more about what the GIIN is doing in this area.
Sure. Yeah, so so in general, we work with a global community that includes over 350 formal member organizations in 52 countries. But our network reaches and engages tens of thousands of people beyond those formal members who are thinking about impact investing in one way or another. We do a lot of educational work. We do work on impact measurement and management. We conduct research and host events. Really trying to move more capital to have a positive impact on the world. We had done some work with faith-based communities in a very limited way, over the years, and then a couple of years ago, we actually started to ramp up some activities, really looking at how we can better support, across faiths, different faith-based investors who are starting to think about how they can actually allocate their capital towards impact investments. And I think it was incredibly exciting. I should clarify that it's not just kind of places of worship that we consider as faith-based investors, but it actually in many ways looks like the broader investment management industry. We see some pension funds that are faith-based some asset management firms, some family offices, some high net worth individuals, as well as houses of worship that have assets and think about how to invest them. And I think it's been incredibly exciting work for us. It's also, we think we're just beginning this journey of, and there's opportunities all around the world where we see more faith-based institutions starting to think about how they can use their investments to advance their broader sense of purpose in the world.
And Elan, I know that you come from the perspective of somebody who's deeply concerned about the erosion of the number of leaders we have in faith-based institutions, and you're stepping in there trying to shore that up. Tell us what your work is all about and what you're doing in the context of the environment we're in today.
There's absolutely a narrative of erosion around the religious world, and my argument is actually, if you look at the other side of that coin, there's incredible opportunity. So I'm the founding director of the Glean Network. It's a network of spiritual entrepreneurs who are building new models of faith in action, and their focuses are on meaning making, building towards equitable justice, and creating a sense of belonging among their constituents. So we've had about 150 different entrepreneurs come through our programs. We have a partnership with Columbia Business School, and what we're seeing is that there are a lot of faith leaders who are coming to a place of understanding that their calling actually is bringing them outside of the traditional brick and mortar surroundings, and that their call to serve is really being deeply felt right now, especially in this moment. We're in the midst of what's being dubbed the Great Recession in America, where thousands and thousands of people are leaving the workforce voluntarily at this point, just over the last 18 months. And among those are about 2,000 faith leaders leaving the pulpit every single month. Whether they're burning out, whether they're finding a new sense of calling, they want to move into a different kind of work, or the work is no longer there. So it leaves us with this incredible moment of opportunity to invite those leaders into really sparking their own moral imagination, their own entrepreneurial imagination, to find new ways to serve in this really rapidly shifting landscape that we're in.
And let's dive a little deeper in trying to work with these leaders. What are you doing with them exactly?
We run a number of different fellowships, and we have a number of different educational offerings, and everything from specifically focusing on training and retraining faith leaders who are in the pulpit or currently serving communities to try to help them reimagine those communities, adapt some of the assets inside of the community, or simply be a more innovative entrepreneurial kind of leader. Then on the other side, we have kind of our marquee fellowship is called the START Fellowship, and that's where we partner with Columbia Business School. And that's an incubator program that we run. It's a 10-week course, and those folks come in with, sometimes it's just as little as an idea that we help them kind of vet and build out over time, ultimately launching before the end of each of our cohort experiences. And other times it's a venture that they've already started, that they are adapting and updating. And really there it's, and when I think about, and then we also have a number of other projects that we do, but when I think about the where all of these meet, it's essentially inviting people to see their ministries as ventures. And then when I speak in other spaces with, secular entrepreneurs who are kind of thinking more about the moral underpinnings of the work that they do, or their own connection to faith that maybe they didn't think they could bring to work, there I'm inviting people to see their ventures as ministries. How can those ventures really serve people? How can they leave the world better than they found it? And so that's where the intersections kind of lie. That's
spectacular. A quick question before I run to Stephanie. Where did the name Glean come from?
Beautiful. So it comes from the idea of gleanings in the field. That again, when I talked about the sabbatical year before, much of Jewish scripture, text, and tradition is really rooted in an agrarian marketplace, an agricultural society. And so the idea of gleanings was that farmers and people who owned their own land and worked the land would actually leave corners of the field for all of the marginalized people in their community. And so when I thought about what does it mean to create an organization called Glean, it really is about centering a lot of those folks who have been outside of the main story, or who have not been the direct beneficiaries of a lot of what religious offerings have been up to date. And that's where the equity work comes in, and that's where the justice work starts. So that's, and the other thing I'll say is religion's a $1.2 trillion industry. There are, even if we're just talking about the corners of that field, or the 10%, the tithing from that harvest, there's an incredible amount of impact that we can have if we really look at that number and everything that's behind it as an opportunity to serve.
Thanks, Elan. What a great name. Stephanie, you are a star. We talk about impact investing capital. We talk about driving capital into communities, but driving capital into communities is almost harder than just raising the capital. Getting capital into the capillaries, as some folks call it, is the hard work, and it's the necessary work, and you're doing that. Tell us what you're doing, and tell us the whole story, and tell us what you're doing, and just give us a bit of inspiration.
Eagle Market Streets has been working in small business development for more than 20 plus years. The Community Equity Fund, which is our highlighted opportunity at this moment, is working toward helping small businesses who've been in operations for 3 to 5 years and who are showing some annual profit of 50,000 or greater to scale even more by job creation. When we think about faith in that respect, all the way from the inception of Community Equity Fund to the first dollars out the door in July of this year, it was a faith walk. I very much, when the idea was floated to Eagle Market Street, said no, that is not a space we can be in, or the work that we can do. And every time I turned it down, the master just put it back in my lap and said, yes, it's your work to do. You have to go do this. So when I became intentional about following the path that was laid for me, it was amazing how even a mustard seed, if we will, of faith turned the tide on something. I can very much remember sitting in a room with my co-founder, Kevin Doyle Jones, and he and I were literally scratching the back of our heads saying, where are we going to get $25,000 to be the floor of this fund? Well, it just dropped in my spirit almost immediately. Why don't you be the change you want to see? So I went to the board and I said, look, we need $25,000 to seed this fund. Can Eagle Market Streets be the first skin in with $10,000? Now, typically, my board probably would have looked at me like I did not understand good English, but oddly enough, in that moment, there was not even much discussion. They wanted to know what Community Equity Fund was, what it could do, and yes, thumbs up all around the table. So I offered that and pause there because there's much more to this story, but to say that as people of faith, if we don't model the change that we want to see, it's a good likelihood that we won't be able to bring others into the fold. So thank you.
And Stephanie, one of the things that I read that Kevin, your colleague, shared was that the importance of a community equity fund is that it tries to solve the racial wealth gap by providing funding for entrepreneurs, for small business owners who might need access to capital, but who don't have the benefit or the privilege of aunts and uncles and brothers and sisters who have been financially well positioned to provide that kind of funding. Can you speak to that?
Absolutely. If most of us in this conversation would agree, at least in peripheral agreement, that 400 years of oppressive behavior, institutionalized systemic behavior has prevented a whole sector of our community from not having resources. So, and I like to tell the story that Kevin tells about trying to stand up some Kiva loans in San Francisco. And they just needed folks to give $25, 25 people to give $25. Well, unfortunately, there was not a single person in that cohort who could give $25 that wasn't spoken for something else. And so when we think about that, that becomes an impetus, if you will, for us to look at innovative and creative ways built on faith and with finance to help these individuals, both business owners and community owners, to build assets and create wealth, which is a overarching umbrella for Eagle Market Streets. In all the work we do, we try our best to instill in our participants the need to understand asset building and wealth creation.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. And I just applaud the work. This is the tough work, I think, getting capital into communities. So thank you for that work. Hey, Amit, the GIIN has sort of a 10,000 foot perspective on what's happening in the impact investment universe as much as anyone. And you can see what's going well, what's not going so well. But when you look at the impact investment landscape or the investment landscape at large, what do you see out there that you think is going right in terms of faith-based institutions doing the right thing, or other institutions being driven by faith and making investment decisions that are helping underserved communities or the environment?
Well, I appreciate the question, and I think one of the things that we see, historically for many, is that you kind of keep your investments very much focused on just business for the sake of business, and not really incorporate other considerations of whether it's a values-based or sustainability or environmental or impact, all the different terms that people use. And that was, it's kind of like a bifurcation of the world. You think about how to do the good in the world through your volunteer time, your philanthropy, kind of your community engagement, and then you invest to invest. And what we've seen kind of happen over the course of particularly in the last decade is a recognition that there is a way of integrating these things that can meet multiple objectives. And it's not always easy by any means, but we see this happening among secular institutions that are actually incorporating broader values. You now see corporations, institutional investors, many individuals who are starting to look around the world and say, actually what Stephanie was saying, we need to be the change that we seek, and we need to figure out how we put all of our assets and resources to work to invest in a better future, whether it's for our family, for our community, for the world at large. And similarly, we've seen a growth in faith-based institutions, thinking about how they can best utilize their assets. And I do want to say it's not starting from a base of zero by any means, because a lot of what we now call impact investing actually rests on activities that come from faith-based communities, of using their investments for activism around social justice. And in the U.S., there's a lot of the intersection of coming out of the civil rights movement, and after more political rights were secured, there was a recognition that we needed economic justice. and a lot of faith-based communities were helping to drive a lot of that activity. So there was a strong interplay in the community development space between activists and banking, and who was getting finance. And I think that is, but what we're now seeing is amplification of that. And this is actually starting to engage much broader sets of faith-based investors who are, of course, wrestling with the complexity of this. How do you incorporate values in the right way? How do they show up in your investment process? How do they show up in your investment selection? And that's something where I think there's a lot to cross-pollinate, if you will, from secular impact investors and faith-based impact investors. And that's why we've been very grateful for the opportunity to do some more work in this area that's been led by my colleague, Kate Walsh, who's been working on how to better engage faith-based investors and help them understand the array of opportunities in impact investing that can help them manifest their values through their investments.
Amit, do you find an interest on the part of any of your investors to invest in community equity funds like the ones that Stephanie just shared with us?
Yes, and I think it's we have a broad spectrum of investors. So we have like huge global institutions that need that have a hard time doing kind of like more micro investments or kind of community level investments. They need to move a lot of capital in big chunks. And then we also have folks who are very deeply engaged in place-based investing, who are kind of like really want to see investments as a way of driving deeper connection at a personal level. And I mentioned those as kind of two extremes to say that these are, there's a lot of different ways in which impact can show up in the way people are investing. But we do see a lot of folks who are really trying to think about how they help have an impact at a community level. I should say also that I think COVID is accelerating this, and we're starting to see early signs of this, but I think this will show up over the coming years, where we've seen such incredible damage done at the community level, and so much also so many marginalized communities that have borne the brunt of damage from the COVID crisis, that we are now seeing, I think, a very visceral understanding of the fragility that many communities have, that is starting to get a lot of people to start to revisit kind of where they do business, where do they buy things, who do they actually give their business to, where do they invest, where do they bank, who gets their savings accounts, who does that get lended to, and I think that there's an opportunity that we're coming into now to really have much more of a deeper shift in the way that people connect to their communities through money.
Let's hold on to that theme of the impact of COVID and the Black Lives Matter movement in the last year. Elan, what have you seen? How has that affected what you're doing? All of the energy that we saw in the Black Lives Matter and all of the tragedy and loss, if you will, that we also felt during COVID. How has that affected what you're doing?
Well, for one, I'll say COVID accelerated every known trend, and it brought a lot of them to light, and it turned incremental change into inflection points like overnight. It didn't. I don't think it created new trends. So when we talk about certainly in my world, when I look at the sociology of religion, it didn't create those new trends. It accelerated a lot of them, and it put a lot of organizations that were maybe teetering close to the brink, it put them squarely on the edge. So that's one piece. And then I think specifically as you're connecting, because I think they are deeply intertwined, the rise in justice work, and of course the Black Lives Matter movement, all of the pain and trauma that came from it and is now being surfaced and in many different forms of public grieving, which I think is such a critical step in moving forward. I think a lot of people are saying enough. But I want to say only, and as this ties to faith and finance, I only think about half the people who should be saying enough are actually saying enough. And where do I come up with that half number? I think there's a lot of people who who are now much more keenly aware of institutional and systemic racism, of the inequities in our society, of the caste systems that many have profited off of, over the years at the cost and expense of so many others who continue to be marginalized. That's the enough that everybody should be saying. There's not one person on the planet who say, no, we should keep doing that. No, enough. It should be over. Now, here's the other half of people who aren't saying enough. And that's where the other trend that COVID accelerated from a financial standpoint is the widening gap between the haves and have-nots in our country. And of course, in the world too, but let's focus specifically here, which is that many of the endowments that we've seen, many of the high net worth individuals probably gained 20 to 30% just in the marketplace over the course of the last 18 months. And a lot of people are now out of work. Not the great resignation folks, but a lot of people who were, needed gainful employment have now lost those jobs. And we're seeing the widening gaps. And the question is, with those folks who are growing in net worth, with those folks who are getting the promotion, getting raises, and is there ever a point at which they can say, perhaps informed by their faith, this is enough. I now have enough. Like, we are literally watching two of the world's richest white men say, actually, world domination isn't enough. I need to go to space and dominate that too. And the question is, at what point are folks like that ever going to be able to say enough? At what point is the economy, the marketplace, the collective consciousness of our society going to be able to point to that kind of behavior, that kind of consolidation of wealth and say, actually, that's enough? And when I talked earlier about the sabbatical year, and this now connects to both of those concepts of enough. When I talked earlier about the sabbatical year, it was a prophetic vision with an understanding that it was going to be human nature to see the world through a lens of scarcity, and therefore to consolidate as much wealth and as much as they could. And then every 7 years, that gets reset. And we don't have a reset button in our society, and we don't have a reset button in our economy, and we don't have a reset button in our marketplace. And that's where that concept of enough we need to explore that much more deeply. The last thing I'll say is, because I was thinking about this word enough, every year in the Jewish community, we sit down and have Passover Seders, these beautiful long dinners where we tell stories. And the quintessential song that I remember growing up, I remember my grandmother made a poster of it, and she had one of those rulers that you grab in the closet, and she would point to the 15 pictures. There's a song called Dayenu, which means that would be enough. And it's not just one verse, it's 15 stanzas, 15 different points in our emancipation story from the book of Exodus, at which we could say, if that's the only gift God had given us, that would have been enough. There are 5 stanzas about becoming freed from slavery. There are 5 about the miracles that God did for us. And then there are 5 about being able to rest and sit with that enough and be with God. And that's an incredible gift, to be able to say that around a table that is full of food and people we love in a freed world. But the truth is, until everybody is emancipated, until everybody can sit around a table with abundant food, and until everybody can look in the eyes of their others and their loved ones and know that they're surrounded by enough, then we're not done. Then the work isn't done. There needs to be a 16th stanza of that, in which we say, until everybody has that opportunity, we can't rest.
Diane is a powerful word. I love that word. Thank you for lifting that up, Elan. Stephanie, Elan was just talking about enough. And you, at the very beginning, were talking about connecting faith and finance. That connection means service of the poor. Elan also talked about the erosion of faith-based leaders and the numbers deteriorating. 1,800 faith-based leaders stepping down once a month. To you, what does that have? What kind of impact does that have on how we look at the economy, how we look at finance, when we have a deterioration in faith-based institutions?
So I'd like to begin my remarks by tagging something that just is really resonating with me from Elan's remarks. And so scripture says that the poor will always be with us. But what I tell myself every day is the poor doesn't have to be 99% while the other is 1%. That there is enough wealth in this country that we can distribute it, allocate it, have it be broadly equitable, if you will, so that even though we will have the poor with us always, they do not have to represent the majority. So I wanted to put that out there because I think it's important for faith community to understand that in order for that philosophy, thought, theology to go forward, they have to be driving it. So more to your question, Otho, what it means to me to have the faith community diminish or be diminished in its strength is that we have fewer and fewer people driving the initiatives around how to be equitable and inclusive. We have always thought, or I've always thought, that the church was the place, or the faith institutions were the place where we could seek equality if we couldn't find it anywhere else. And so with erosion, to use the term, being the prevailing order of the day, we have less and less people who understand that that really is true, that there's one body with many members. All of those members have their fit, and the King James Version says fit. I translate that to be perfect. It's the perfect place in the body that they have. And the B part of that is even more important. It says, even the weak among you have their perfect place in your body, so that we understand that without strong leadership, without people who can convey, or ministers who can convey that we are indeed the answer in some respects, I think that we just have more and more of the sum zero mentality that exists among us right now. Thank you for the question.
Thanks, Stephanie. You know, as long as we're on morality, Amit, I'll share that at the New York Fed, our mission is to make sure that we support an economy that works for all segments of society. And that is a statement that precedes me. But I'm wondering, from your perspective, as long as we're talking about morality, is that a mission that is should be driven due to the practicality of, if we have all segments of society engaged in the economy, that will only strengthen the economy? Or should that be just morally driven, regardless of the benefits for the economy? Is that a morally important mission? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you know, this comes up a lot in the investment space around you know, this term that, you know, is probably well known to most of our audience, around like materiality, of, you know, that you can actually consider things like you know, social dimensions or kind of climate change, as long as you can prove that they're financially material. You know, so as long as you can prove that they actually have some impact on the risk or return of an investment. But, you know, what can often get lost in that is actually just the broader sense of purpose, you know, which is, you know, even if you can't necessarily prove these things, if you can achieve your financial objectives and, you know, invest in the world because you think it's the right thing to do, that is inherently, you know, of value and sufficient motivation. And I think that's, you know, kind of what I'm hearing a little bit from the question is something, you know, something very analogous of, you know, there may be a financial imperative to do certain things. And so like right now, there's a lot of discussion about diversity and the financial imperative around, you know, that it just leads to better business, or you reach broader markets, or you kind of, you know, you have, you know, more productive teams, better decision-making, and so on. But there's also just saying that this is the way we want to be as a world, and that you know, and you know, and that this is the way we want our society to look, and see the economy in service of that society, as opposed to the other way around. And I think that is something that I think is very much being contested as we speak right now, and in very interesting ways. When I was young, I grew up in Northern California, and there's lots of activists, who were, very critical of our economic system and the inequality. And that was largely the refrain of activists. Now, fast forward to today, we actually see a lot of work, and with the GIIN are doing work around what's the future of capitalism, and how do we actually reimagine capitalism so it does work for all people. So it does work for the planet, and also so it works for long-term economic sustainability. And the people who are now calling for a better form of capitalism or a better form for economic system and calling for systems change still includes activists, as you'd expect, but it also includes everything from titans of industry. Many CEOs are now talking about this. We see billionaires who have been enriched by the system as it currently is designed, who have also been saying that this is a system that needs to change. And it's very common now for corporate CEOs to actually have points of view on how the system should change, which is hasn't yet translated into the type of systemic change that we need. But it is a very different landscape for this conversation, and people I think are wrestling with the complexity of having impact objectives or a financial motivation, and trying to figure out how to reconcile these. But I think it's important that we do, because it's clear that the system we have in place is not working, and that we need to think about a different way of organizing our economy, so it does actually create value for all, and then also that it does contribute to a sustainable ecosystem and a sustainable planet as well.
We're coming to the end of our session, but I would feel remiss if I didn't give you all an opportunity to just lift up that one idea, that one thought that you wanted to share, but that you didn't have an opportunity to share in the last 30, 45 minutes. So Elan, I'm going to start with you. What is the one idea, thought, wish, anything you want to leave us with in the final few minutes here?
It's gosh, one idea. I'm just, as I'm hearing, my fellow panelists speak, I'm thinking that I want to lift up all of their ideas, because I'm leaving feeling so full, just being a student of the two of you. This is maybe, kind of a simple, maybe it's a simple thing to say, but as I said before, I think we're at an incredible moment of opportunity. And it's on the flip side of the coin of erosion of American religion. We look at some top line numbers, almost 2,000 faith leaders leaving the pulpit every month. Somewhere between 20 and 30% of our houses of worship in America, there's about 344,000 totals. 20 to 30% of that are going to close in the next 18 months. That's the narrative of erosion, right? The younger folks are not affiliating. And I want to offer the flip side of that coin. And that's where I'm an eternal optimist. So you could tell me 99% are going to close, and I would say, I think we got a chance. But I look at it this way. There's an incredible, a generational transfer that is soon to happen in the religious sphere. And if I were to tell you that you can become the CEO, you can join the steering committee, some kind of leader of a company, multinational, global company, that had more real estate holdings than the entire country of France per square foot, that had more revenue than the top 10 tech companies combined, that had more followers than all the social media platforms combined. Would you say, gosh, that seems like a pretty good opportunity? Would you buy stock? Would you short the stock? In my humble opinion, I look at that and say we are in an incredible moment of opportunity, in which there is a generation that is now awakened to the incredible opportunities and inequities and injustices, and finding ways to reconcile those two in building a faith that's really worthy of the very followers that we consider to be part of our communities here. So that for me is the resounding question to leave with, which is, what if we looked at this like an historical moment of incredible opportunity? And that's what I see ahead of us.
That's terrific, Elan. Thank you. Stephanie, what are your final thoughts, wishes, anything you feel you have to share with us? And we'd love to hear it.
Much like Elan, a myriad of things are bubbling up. What a wonderful conversation we've been having this afternoon, and much things to think about. But for me in this moment, my attention and my heart is leaning to a Latin saying that says carpe diem. And carpe diem is strike while it's hot. And so I think that, you know, if we have any job to do, that is it, to not miss the moment that is before us to shift paradigms and change the world. Because as Margaret Mead said, never forget that a small group of people will change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And so I am excited to be in this time in my life where, you know, I'm not Einstein by any means, but the wisdom of several years rest in me to do the work that I've been called to do and not short from it. So thank you. And thank you both for joining us today.
Thanks, Stephanie. Amit.
Yeah, just the one thing I'd raise, and I'm really grateful to be part of this conversation. And you know, there's you know, a lot of inspiration and ideas that have already, you know, that I'll take away from this. I think one thing that, you know, just in the moment that we're in, where, you know, the pandemic has brought us all kind of, you know, much more local, you know, and you know, it's brought a lot of our time horizon, you know, much short, you know, to be much shorter, because I think that's one of the byproducts of crisis. It's also underscored, though, how interconnected and interdependent we all are, and I think that we're seeing this show up in terms of the, you know, the public health situation that we have. We're seeing this in terms of the supply chain. We're seeing this in terms of, you know, so many different kind of like signs of, you know, when we look at climate change and, you know, things happening in one part of the world and how they affect other parts of the world. You know, it does really underscore the fact that you know, we do need to think about, you know, this in terms of the overall system. And that, you know, if we're looking at, you know, trying to have healthy communities, we need a healthy planet and a healthy global community as well. And I think that that is, you know, something that we all want for a future, and it's an incredibly important time to think about, if that's the future that we want, we have to invest in it. And that's where I think there's such a great conversation for us to continue to have at this intersection of faith and finance. So thank you.
Thanks, Amit. Thank you, all three of you. This has been a really lovely, inspirational conversation. I love the work that you're doing. We know that we need an economy that works for all segments of society. We need an economy that's more inclusive. In order for it to be more inclusive, there is not only a practical imperative behind it, but there's a moral imperative behind it. And in order for it to be more inclusive, we have to have people like you driving the more moral piece of it. And in fact, faith is going to be a strong component of that moral compass, what drives our moral decisions. Dayenu, carpe diem, let's seize the day. Let's take this moment and do something with it. And I want to wish you all a great day. Thank you for joining us, and I thank the audience for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wow. Well, full confession, this is not the first chance I've had to hear that conversation. I was privileged to listen in while it was being recorded, but I feel like it was just as rich and meaningful, and I was able to glean so much more second time around. I'm Rachel Johnson. I'm part of the Faith and Finance team, and it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome you all to this webinar and conversation today. We are so glad to have you as part of this kickoff conversation for our Building a Just and Loving Economy series. It is my pleasure now to invite to join me on screen two of our panelists, Rabbi Elan Babchuck with the Glean Network and Stephanie Swepson-Twitty with Eagle Market Streets Development Corporation. They were both able to come back and be part of our live Q&A. I also have with me my fellow Faith and Finance team member, Kevin Doyle Jones. He and I will be taking your questions and putting them to this all-star panel. So please feel free to continue to put them in the chat in the Q&A feature. Stephanie, Elan, thank you so much for being with us today and for being part of this kickoff conversation. Well, as we give some time for folks to put more questions in the chat, I want to start off our Q&A with a question of my own. As the person who wrote the title for this this conversation, I feel a little bit of ownership to immediately problematize the title. It's Connecting Faith and Finance. I want to kick us off by asking why. Why should we care about connecting faith and finance? Impact investing, entrepreneurship, community development, they're all happening and can happen outside of the involvement of faith communities. So why are we having this conversation? And maybe put it another way, is there anything that's lost if faith communities and people of faith aren't part of this work? Stephanie, I think I'll start with you, if you don't mind.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us back and for giving us an opportunity to be a part of the Q&A. My initial thoughts around why should we connect, why should faith and finance be connected? Because I think that without question, it is scriptural. It is rooted in the principles and doctrine of understanding how we should be in community, regardless to what the religious or doctrine that we follow. The general premise of taking care of each other is at the heart of connecting faith and finance. Again, I hearken back to my remarks when I think about the body, and that the body is one unit and that it has all of the members working in it, but in it also are some weak in the body. And so who's to care for the weak? The faith community. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Elan?
Yeah, I just want to say, like, ditto to what Stephanie just said. I'm so glad you went first because that way I get to just say, yeah, that's exactly right. I think, and I started to get at this, you know, in the introductory comments, but I think, why does faith have to be connected to finance? Why should they be in conversation? Because we see what happens when they're not, right? Because faithless finance gets us exactly where we are right now, with widened gaps, greater inequities, more marginalization, more consolidation of wealth, and you know, a couple of people going up to space while most of us are never going to make it out of the town we grew up in, right? So we know what faithless finance looks like, but then at the same time, we also know what happens in the faith space when we look at finance without a faith lens. What do I mean by that? An individual institution building up its wealth and its endowment and the value of its building without looking around and saying, gosh, what kind of impact should we be having on our broader community? That's financeless faith, right? And so I think the reason why they have to be in conversation is because we know what happens when they're not. And I think especially when we think about the financial marketplace and this, you know, the rising trends around entrepreneurship and venture capitalism, you know, my colleague and teacher, Erwin Kula, he often talks about remoralizing capital. So what would happen actually if we could, and I don't care, don't call it faith, call it morals, call it values, call it ethics. If the whole religion thing, you know, freaks you out, that's fine. But if there's only one bottom line and there's no higher power that we're answering, I don't mean God, right? For me, that's my higher, but I mean, I'm talking about greater aspirations that this marketplace doesn't even have to answer to, but at least take into consideration. we're just going to continue going down the path we've been going, which is getting us nowhere fast.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that a little bit of forward promotion for our next in our series. Your response makes me think that our next conversation is going to be the economy is not gravity. And it's this idea that the economy isn't a force of nature that's shaping us. And can't relate to that is it's there we seem to have a myth that the economy is amoral. It's the neutral arbiter that that determines value and isn't coming with a biased moral lens. So we're going to unpack that a bit in our next series, but I want to bring it forward a little bit because I am curious if we do have this myth out there that there's kind of an amoral economy. What are the types of questions that bringing morality into the conversation raise? What does a moral values-based economy look like? And I will call on, leave it open for anyone to jump in.
Well, Pastor, I feel a little bit uncomfortable going ahead of you, but I will jump in the deep end here and say, if I heard the question correctly, what does moral society look like? Is that, yeah. I think as many of the members of the audience have noted, I think there is, and Rabbi said it best, we tend to get stuck sometimes around nomenclature and around what are we going to call it, and is it faith, is it this, and I like what he had to say about morally. How are you guiding your own values to have an impact on what community does with a value system? So, and succinctly to say, I am very much a person who is committed to working with small businesses to help them improve their position in community so that they can better help community. To me, that is my moral imperative to do that work so that all of community is improved in some respect. So I will rest there.
This is Kevin, and John, I'd like to jump in on the why question. I did an interview with Sister Corrine Florick. She's called the godmother of CDFIs, Community Development Finance Institutions, which are the institutions set up to lend to marginalized communities. And she's a nun. She said early in her career, the bishop would send 2 nuns to start a school or a clinic in a place, and then there weren't that many nuns. So she realized they needed to send their money as co-ministers. And so she was one of the first that actually started nuns lending. And now she's done it for 40 plus years. It's phenomenally successful, and 40 plus years has fewer than 10 failures. And she is leading a fund that is combined of 37 other Catholic women's religious orders follow her lead on what to invest. And I said, well, what's your theory of change? How do you really think about this? And she said, well, there's the Good Samaritan. And I said, okay. And the other gospel stories. And we just do that. And that was the end of her theory of change. It's like, we were told to do this, so therefore we do it. And it's neighborliness and tending to those in trouble out of your abundance to enable them to get back on their feet and get on the road is what she's done for 4 decades, and why 38 Catholic nun orders follow her lead. And she has just a really simple thing, they're the gospel stories. So what's next? No big theory of change.
Love that, Kevin. Thank you I'm glad you jumped. I'm glad both of you went for this. Is all just, God has a plan, right? And I'm just here to follow it. I love that you brought up the Good Samaritan piece, and that's where I actually wasn't planning on going this direction, but this is where I want to go. when you talk about what does a remoralizing of capital look like? What does an economy look like that works for every individual? What happens when Amex's 10,000 small business campaign turns into 10 million small businesses and everyone's taking ownership of their financial future and they're getting invested in by their communities? What does that prophetic vision actually look like? Now, here's the thing. The Good Samaritan study, I think it was 1973, if I'm not mistaken, there was a social psychology study to test out whether or not seminary students would actually help someone in need while they were on their way from one building to another. And they had, I won't get into all the details of the study, you can Google it, it's amazing. But when we think about what actually controlled their behavior, it wasn't, they were told you can write a sermon about the Good Samaritan. That had no impact on whether or not they stopped. They were told you can write a sermon about ministry and how important ministry is in the world. Didn't affect whether or not they stopped. You know what did? Whether or not they were running late. Why? So what does that tell us about it is a privilege to be a good Samaritan? It is a privilege to be a good Samaritan because you have 10 minutes to spare. Because you're not rushing from your first job to your second job to pick up your kids and go back to your third job, right? What does the world look like if we can remoralize and bring in faith values into this kind of marketplace? It means that people have margins in their time, margins in their talent, margins in their treasure, and margins in their trust. All of this stuff is eroding because we don't have those margins, and the margins are not evenly spread. That's what the world looks like. And then all of us can live up to the potential. I believe every single person is born good. Every single person wants to stop for the person next to them. I really believe that. By the way, the most popular show in Netflix's history, Squid Game, which is out right now, the entire show hinges upon whether or not people will make the kind choice for one another and stop to help someone else. It's fascinating. Anyway, that's where I think the world actually could look like if we go there.
That's incredible, and I think a beautiful vision, and I think ties or leads really well into a question we received in the chat from Erwin, and Elan, it was directed at you, so I'll start swinging back to you, but Kevin, Stephanie, please jump in also. So Erwin asks, given the erosion of the religious sector, all the loss that you talked about, Elan, obviously religious institutions need to reimagine themselves as it relates to faith and finance. But is there an opportunity / responsibility or even competitive advantage for companies, businesses, capital allocators to get done some of the jobs that faith spaces historically have aspired to do? So I guess what I'm hearing in Erwin's question is, traditionally we've thought, oh, there's a Baptist hospital because no one else is providing healthcare in the area. There's this service because the faith community saw a need. And we need to rethink this whole faith community props up when there's a hole, and reimagine partnerships.
I think I love Erwin's question. I think part of the opportunity here, and I'm going to speak, I'm like inside faith. So I'm going to do the inside faith response, which is, and I'm going to quote another one of my teachers, Brad Hirschfield. He says, when are we going to ever take yes for an answer? Right? And what I mean by that is, like, in the faith world, when we see people outside of religion doing religious kind of stuff, sometimes it doesn't feel so good, right? Sometimes it feels weird. So, wait, what do you mean Soul Cycle's doing, like, they light candles and they inspire people? That's our job. What do you mean, right? Or Peloton has Sundays with love. It's basically a church service with 30 minutes and you get to sweat, right? Like, if I'm leading churches on Sundays and my congregants go in there, I would be upset. And it also is an indication that we made it. It's also an indication that a lot of our highest aspirations in the religious domain, whether they are getting adopted, appropriated, mimicked in secular spaces, means that those jobs are universal and we're not the only ones that can do them. So I think then the opportunity is to think strategically, what would it look like to partner with maybe, unlike strange bedfellows, companies, for-profit companies that maybe prior to this had no business doing. So I wonder, what would it look like? What would it look like if an entire denomination, a powerful denomination of religion, had partnered with WeWork before they turned into the cynical mess that they became? I don't know. Could there have been a different intervention? Could it have turned into something more wholesome? Maybe. But I think that's where the possibility lies.
So I'm going to jump in here if I can, and I'm going to hopefully create a segue for Kevin to talk about this amazing paper that he wrote. So if we think about organized religion, which I am real careful to let folks know, I am a practicing Christian. I am not religious. And so, what that did when I accepted that revelation is it liberated me to say that the only prescription I have to follow is the one that I chose, which is prescribed by Christ and the Bible. If your thought around how you want to be in society lines up with some other doctrine or thought, and you continue to do good, you continue to work so that the greater masses are served by the work you do, I'm right behind you. Regarding church and the kind of institutionalized way we've gotten ourselves, and this is where I'm leading to Kevin, I think that there's an adage that says that religion is the opium of the masses, and I translate that to mean that it was the way that oppressors used it to be able to lull the people into conformity. For me, thanks to a creator who I trust, he did not make me to be a conformist. And so for that reason, I would look at where we are now and say that we could upend all of that. We could become community development corporations who have faith-based guidelines that we're going to follow, or that we have other Unitarian or other doctrine that we're going to follow that serve the greater good. So Kev, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your white paper, if you don't mind.
Well, thanks, I appreciate it. I wrote this for, I spent a lot of time in Mississippi, and one of the virtues of Mississippi is that the races don't lie. And so you know race in a more clear sense in Mississippi than you do in other places. And I came to the conclusion that Mississippi's racism is what was keeping everybody back. And so I became aware of that as a business person in Mississippi. And so I looked into the history of racism in a lot of ways. And I looked into the Encyclopedia of Religion in the South. And I'll start with an incident when we being my wife, had built the largest Habitat for Humanity chapter in the country in Jackson, Mississippi. And everybody had built a house. The Junior League had built a house. The law firms had built a house. The accounting firms, obviously the churches, the Sunday schools, the one synagogue. And finally, a First Baptist church came and built a house. And they said, "You're probably wondering why we've built a house, because it's not about saving souls." And we said, "No, we're wondering why you're 3 years behind the Junior League and 2 years behind the insurance defense law firm." But what happened was they only could see saving souls. And if you go back to the Encyclopedia of Religion in the South, as I said, back in the early 1700s, most of the slave owners were Anglicans, now we're called Episcopalians, and they were approached by the dirt farming, non-plantation owning Baptists who wanted to preach to the slaves. And the Anglicans looked at it a long time, and here's the bargain that they struck. They said, "Okay, you have to preach that Exodus is spiritual. It does not mean let my people go. It means swing low, sweet chariot, and the sweet by and by. It had to spiritualize freedom from slavery. And then the second thing is, you could not mention Jubilee. You could not mention the forgiveness of debts. You could not mention the turning over of the land so there wasn't intergenerational empires created, and or anything like that, because the core was the slaves were the source of capital. And so to preach to them about spiritual things, they had to agree with the plantation owners that slaves were commodities. And so they could preach about individual salvation, but they could not preach about collective salvation. And I ran into that in the 1980s, talking to Robert Moses, who was the architect of the Freedom Summer, when Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner were killed in Mississippi, and all the people came down and tried to get voter registration. They had to recreate a curriculum around Exodus for older Black folks to be able to say, I can go sign up to vote. It is the source of my freedom. And so I think, a lot of the white church has been complicit with the monopoly plantation owners, from, Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg to the folks at the plantations. And they've signed off to a smaller spiritual religion. And they did it a couple hundred years ago. And so that the guy at the Baptist church doesn't know why he can't say we're involved in the community, because the decision to have a smaller God was made by his great-great-grandfather. And so we're saying to people, hey, break that bargain. That's a devil's bargain. We are our brother's keeper. We are our neighbors. My basic understanding is the neighborly economy, as outlined by the theologian Walter Brueggemann. If you Google neighborhood economics and Walter Brueggemann, and you'll misspell Brueggemann, but that's okay. It'll still find it. There's a great video he did at one of our conferences. And neighborliness means being interdependent and connected. And so that means
I think we're losing Kevin here a bit. So I'll jump in.
Everybody, and we all have to be white people. And I'm done. That's the end of the story.
Oh yeah, thanks, Kevin. Well, I think we caught the vast majority of it. Just missed the tail end. And for folks watching, I'm actually sticking that video of Walter Brueggemann in the chat, so you can find it there. Well, so we have two separate questions, one from Martha and one from Kim. But I kind of see them as two different sides of the same coin. So I'm gonna combine them and again kind of toss it out to all three of you, because I think whoever feels answering, because I think each of you in your own way have 2 feet in different worlds, or maybe have multiple feet in many worlds. But there's having this conversation on the faith side with faith communities. But then there's that finance side, which very loosely defined is everything not faith community, and we've already just talked about how very deeply problematic that is. So Martha wants to know, how do you help faith communities discern tangible ways to undertake an economic justice problem? Like how can communities of faith and people of faith who haven't been engaged in this work before start to jump in? Well, Kim is asking, as a financial planner, how can she start to introduce the concepts of values and morality that we talked about in the conversation? This idea that just because I'm in the investment world doesn't mean I shouldn't be thinking about morality. How do you start to have that conversation over in those non-faith spaces, so to speak?
I think part of the work is, look, I think there's maybe 3 frames. The first is there's a great way that rabbinic teachers in the Talmud would sort of end arguments between their students. And they would, if they felt like their students were stuck in theory and not understanding how it actually applied to people's lives, they would say, Puk chazi ma'ama davar, which is Aramaic for saying, go out and see what people really are doing, what they're saying, what they need, how they experience the world. Life is not lived in theory, it's lived in practice and experience. So first thing, if you're a church thinking about, gosh, we have a really valuable property, we have money in an endowment, we have we have wisdom, we have traditions, we have things that we can share and give. First thing, look around you. We don't need to look too far to find the need, and also to identify who is around you, right? If now that's one of the most important things, and maybe expand the definition of who it is that you as a community leader really serve. Is it just the people who pass the plate and show up on Sunday, or is it, or do we have a broader sense of service here, or maybe a bigger sense of calling? So the first thing is to pukhaze, get out. The second is, I think, to look at it through an entrepreneurial lens, which means to say, the definition of entrepreneur that I like to use is the bearer of risk. And so here you have to ask yourself the question, how much am I really willing to risk? How much am I really willing to risk? So, okay, we don't want to play by the market rules because usury, and okay, would you go with a 0% return when the market's making 12? Would you actually not even have an endowment and sunset your fund so that you know it's going to be gone in 5 years, but you are going to do such good work in 5 years? Would you give it all away today? Those are all viable answers, but you need to know exactly what you're willing to risk before you enter that conversation, because otherwise the conversation starts with idealism and theory, and then you get to the, okay, I think we're ready to write this check. Can the treasurer sign it? And the treasurer says, whoa, no, my job's to keep the lights on. My job's not to, that's not my job. So that's where you really have to understand how going out and knowing exactly what you're willing to risk in that going out process, it enables a community to really move forward and live their values.
Thank you, Rabbi. And I want to tag you just a little bit and say everything he said. and to add briefly that I think to do this, you want to build it with community. So we've been socialized to think we build it, they come. Well, how about if we format that and we build it with them, and then we can all come. So, I think that a sense of church kind of being here and the congregants being here and the community being there is a concept that we can start to reimagine, if you will, and then we see how we can have a different part in it. One of the things that I would champion is what Rabbi said about being an entrepreneur or thinking like an entrepreneur. And I love how you said we're the ones that take the risk. So whenever we put together unique opportunity, Kevin and myself, called the Community Equity Fund. Community Equity Fund is just that. It is all about a CDC taking the risk of working with businesses in a different way than society has been working with them. So instead of conventional debt, we have equity. The equity is repayable, but they have a flexible mode to pay that equity back. So, those are the kinds of things I would think about. I would think about thriving community. What does it take to have a thriving community? And how does the church have a small or large role in being a thriving community? So, yes.
I would add looking at your assets that you may not see. Back in Itawamba County, we were a small town halfway between Memphis and Birmingham, and two Catholic nuns moved to town and introduced me to the concept of presence. And they didn't have a plan, but they looked and saw what the need was. And they discovered there were a lot of transient people who were sleeping in their cars, poor folks sleeping in their cars on the road. And so they got half a dozen churches to agree that
I'll be where the folks can sleep on the weekend this week, you be the second week. And so the asset was, you know, their fellowship halls with just, you know, mattresses down less than once a month. Another thing I saw another church do was, you know, looking at their actual vendors, and the woman who was sewing the choir gowns really needed a surgeon to make her business be more real and almost full time. And so they invested in a surgeon, and she paid her back. Electrician, who was a single guy doing it, and he couldn't pay for the RFPs that would let him hire more people. And so they actually just invested in the people they were already paying to become real businesses and moved from sole proprietors to job creators. So there's lots of ways you can do that just with the people that your church is already engaged with. Or, you know, what we found in our community equity fund is that the first money in were from $5 to something. They put the money, they were the first dollars into the community equity fund, $2,500. And then the Episcopal Diocese had been looking for something like this, and they have 25,000, and then another person of faith. And what we find is that people of faith can often be the visionary catalyst investors. That's kind of my new phrase for them in the capital stack at the very bottom. They invest in what ought to be. They will give their money to invest in what ought to be, but isn't quite there yet. They invest in the substance of things that should be happening in the future. So there are a lot of ways you can just take your passing the plate, turning it into something that creates an asset that can grow over time.
Right.
Kevin, thank you for, excuse me, Rachel, I just wanted to add one thing there for mentioning the first in. The actual first in community equity fund was Eagle Market Streets. Eagle Market Streets was so committed to the idea of being able to support this initiative that we put our own funds in, which leveraged then the faith community coming in, the Ladies Social Circle, and others. So I think it's important to know that when we talk about asset building and wealth creation, that we think about ourselves as an asset. I think oftentimes that gets lost. We have, again, been socialized to think about assets being the tangible things that we can put our hands on and accumulate for 50 years. A building, whatever. And actually assets building starts with yourself. It starts with you knowing the value of who God created you to be so that you can do other things. So yeah.
Thanks, Steph, for the correction.
Amen.
Appreciate it.
Amen. Well, I feel like, you know, we can continue this conversation for much longer, but unfortunately we are at our time. So I'm gonna steal Otho's last question to wrap us out. And, you know, having the opportunity to have now reflected on the fuller conversation with Otho and Amit, to be part today of this time together, and this time together and see our participants. Any final thoughts? And Stephanie, I know we had you just for time, so if you need to drop, please feel free. But thank you so much for being here. Any final thoughts, and then we'll wrap up.
If you want to reach any one of us, you can just email info@faithfinance.net. We'll send it to Stephanie or Elan or me or whoever. So
Absolutely.
Yeah, the only last thing I would say here is, you know, we're talking about a massive tectonic shift in how religion relates to finance, relates to itself, its own assets, and I think that when there is change, especially a sea change, there's going to be a lot of loss, and I think we need to go where that loss is experienced. We need to go towards that sense of loss and grief, and we ourselves are going to experience some of it too. You know, it's easy for me to say, oh, we can sunset an endowment, but not when that endowment's paying for my kid's education or for the synagogue that I call home, right? That's hard. So I think it's really important, no matter how certain we are about the path forward, that we can, you know, to make finance a more faithful entity and to make faith a more financially equitable institution, I also think that we need to sit with what is the experience of the person who disagrees with me completely and for whom my prophetic vision is actually it evokes such a profound sense of loss. And I think we need to hold that up as scripture too, because that's real.
Thank you, Elan. I really appreciate it. Thank you for being part of this conversation. And thank you to all of you who have joined us today. So grateful. Our next conversation will be November 15th at 1 p.m. It is The Economy is Not Gravity, and I'm really looking forward to that one, in part because it's the message I need to hear and be reminded of constantly. And then our third conversation will be the first week of December. It's Beyond Rugged Individualism. What is the common good? So we'll be delving into this idea of, if the economy is something that we can shape, then what should we shape it into? So please be on the lookout for more information about that. To keep up to date with with this series and all of the great work of Faith+Finance and all of our partners, many of them are throwing wonderful events around the same conversation. Please sign up for our newsletter. You can do so. There's link in the chat, and we will be thrilled to keep this conversation going. Sorry for not being able to get to everyone's questions, but as Kevin said, you might email us at info@faithfinance.net. We will try to respond to as many as we can. And lastly, I just want to thank our partners, especially Trinity Wall Street, who has made this series possible through a partnership with us, and Glean Network and so many more who are helping us spread the word and start this conversation. Thank you, and see you again next time.